The throne had been empty for 300 years, by stewards who managed the realm in the absence of royalty. But because the throne itself would accept no one, it was not merely a chair of stone and gold. For 300 years no one had carried that mark. The royal line had ended with King Aldrich, who had died without heirs, and with his death the throne had gone silent. It no longer responded to anyone who approached it. The kingdom had adapted. The Council of Regents governed well enough, making decisions by vote, distributing power among themselves to prevent any single person from claiming too much authority. But there were those who believed the kingdom had lost something essential when the throne went silent, that without a true ruler, without someone bound to the land through the ancient magic, the realm was slowly dying. The harvests were not as abundant as they once were. The winters grew harsher, and there were stories, passed down through generations, that said the throne was not truly empty, that somewhere in the world someone carried the mark of kingship, and when that person finally came to the throne, everything would change. Her name was Kira, and she had lived her entire life in the Northern Territories, in a region so far from the capital that the council's authority was more theory than practice. She worked as a cartographer, mapping the wild lands beyond the kingdom's borders. It was solitary work, requiring long journeys alone, but she preferred it that way. She had never felt entirely comfortable among people, had always sensed something different about herself that she could not name. She had dreams sometimes, vivid and recurring, of a place she had never been, a throne carved from a single piece of black rock that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and a voice ancient and patient, calling her home. She dismissed the dreams as imagination, as the product of too many nights camping alone under the stars. But they persisted, growing stronger as she aged, until she could no longer ignore them. When she turned 28, she made a decision. Would prove that her mind was simply fixating on stories she had heard as a child. Or perhaps it would reveal something she had been avoiding her entire life. The journey took 6 weeks. Kira traveled light, carrying only what she needed, mapping the route as she went out of professional habit. The kingdom was larger than she had realized, more varied, and she found herself fascinated by the changes in landscape, in architecture, and the way people spoke and dressed and conducted their lives. The capital was overwhelming. She had never seen so many people in one place, never experienced the noise and density of a city where thousands lived within shouting distance of each other. Kira stood before it, feeling small and foolish, wondering what she had expected to accomplish by coming here. The throne was sealed in a chamber that no one entered, guarded by tradition, and probably by actual guards. She could not simply walk in and demand to see it, but she had come this far. "I would like to request an audience," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "With whom?" One guard asked, looking bored. "With ... whoever grants permission to view the throne." Both guards straightened, their boredom replaced by suspicion. "The throne is sealed. No one views it." "I understand. But I have traveled from the Northern Territories, and I believe I may have information relevant to the throne S. condition." It was a lie, or at least a stretching of the truth, but it worked. The guards exchanged glances, and one disappeared into the palace. "I study patterns, connections, the way things relate to each other. I believe there may be a connection between the throne's silence and certain changes in the land, changes I have observed in my work. It was vague enough to sound plausible, specific enough to suggest she knew what she was talking about. The wait stretched into hours. Kira sat on a bench in the courtyard, watching servants and officials move through the palace grounds, and she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But finally the woman returned. "The council has granted your request. You may view the throne, but you will be escorted at all times. You may not touch anything, and you will leave immediately if instructed to do so." "I understand." As though the building were too large for the people who inhabited it, they descended stairs, moving deeper into the structure until they reached a hallway that ended in a set of massive doors carved with symbols Kira did not recognize. "We open it occasionally for maintenance to ensure the structure remains sound, but no one has sat upon the throne in all that time. Do you understand the significance of what you are about to see?" "I believe so." The woman produced a key, ancient and ornate, and unlocked the doors. It was exactly as she had seen it, the high ceilings, the white stone walls, and in the center, raised on a dais of 3 steps, the throne itself. And she felt something stir inside her, recognition, belonging, the sense that she had finally found the place she was meant to be. She climbed the steps without thinking, without asking permission, drawn by a compulsion stronger than thought. The woman behind her called out, alarmed, but Kira did not stop. She reached the top step, stood before the throne, and looked down at it. The stone was warm, and she heard the voice from her dreams, clearer now, no longer distant or muffled by sleep. "Sit." She should have been afraid. She should have questioned, hesitated, backed away. But instead she sat. The moment she touched the throne, the world exploded, and she felt the bond awaken. The bond was older than the throne, older than the kingdom, older than memory. It was the connection between ruler and realm, the magic that allowed a king to feel his people, to sense their needs. Kira gasped, her hands gripping the armrests, her body arching as the bond flooded through her. She felt everything. Every person in the kingdom, millions of souls, each one a point of light in an infinite constellation. She felt their joys and their sorrows, their hopes and their fears, all of it alive in a way she had never imagined. She felt where the land was strong and where it was weak, where it thrived and where it struggled, where it needed help and where it needed to be left alone. It was too much. No human mind was meant to hold this much information, this much sensation. Not until the binding was complete. And you must find the others. Others? Kira tried to form the question, but her mind was too fractured, too overwhelmed. What others? The bond cannot be carried alone. It will destroy you if you try. Not broken, but muted, reduced to a level that Kira could almost bear. She slumped in the throne, gasping for breath, her body shaking, her mind reeling. "She is bound," the woman whispered, her face pale with shock. "The throne has chosen her. After 300 years, it is finally chosen." News of the awakening spread through the capital like wildfire. The Council of Regents convened an emergency session. Kira remained in the throne chamber for 3 days, unable to move, trapped in the binding that was still settling into her bones. Servants brought her food and water, physicians checked her health, and scholars studied her from a distance, trying to understand what had happened. but no one could approach the throne. The barrier remained, protecting her or imprisoning her, depending on how one looked at it. The bond had settled into something she could manage, a constant awareness of the kingdom that no longer threatened to shatter her mind. She descended from the throne on shaky legs, and the barrier fell away, allowing the guards to rush forward and steady her. "I am fine," she said, though her voice was hoarse from disuse. "Or I will be. I need time to understand this." The council was waiting for her in an adjacent chamber, 12 men and women who had governed the kingdom for decades, and they looked at her with a mixture of hope, suspicion, and resentment. "What is your lineage, your family? Where do you come from?" "I am from the Northern Territories. My family were foresters, traders, map-makers. I have no noble blood that I know of, no connection to the old royal line. Perhaps it survived in hidden lines, in families who did not know what they carried. All I know is that the throne recognized me, and now I am bound to it." Varin leaned forward, his eyes hard. "You understand that this changes everything. The council has governed for 300 years. We have maintained stability, prosperity, peace. But the bond is telling me that the kingdom needs more than administration. I believe that is why the throne waited so long. It was not just waiting for royal blood. It was waiting for the right person at the right time. And you believe you are that person. I do not know what I am, but the throne does." The bond had awakened. Like it or not, the kingdom had a ruler again. And the bond, while muted, was still there, a constant pressure at the edge of her consciousness. Border disputes, taxation policies, judicial appointments. They presented her with documents to sign, proposals to approve, judgments to render, and she felt paralyzed by the weight of it all. Every decision affected thousands of lives. Every choice rippled through the kingdom in ways she could feel through the bond, but could not fully comprehend. The kingdom was vast, its problems complex, and she was drowning in information she did not have the context to process. Worse, she could feel the weight of it wearing on her. The guardian in the bond had warned her that she could not carry this alone, that she needed to find others who were meant to stand with her, but she did not know what that meant. Others like her? She began to have nightmares. Not the dreams of the throne that had called her to the capital, but visions of failure, of the kingdom collapsing, because she was inadequate, because she could not do what the throne expected of her. The palace healers worried about her health. She was losing weight, not sleeping enough, pushing herself past the point of exhaustion. But she did not know how to stop. The bond showed her suffering every moment people hungry, that perhaps someone who had sat on it out of curiosity rather than preparation was not fit to rule. Other council members began to echo his concerns, and Kira could feel their doubt through the bond, could sense them losing confidence in her. And every time he succeeded, her confidence eroded a little more. A presence similar to her own, touching the edges of the bond, another marked soul, somewhere in the kingdom awakening to the magic now that the throne was occupied. The sensation was like finding water in a desert. She was not alone. Kira focused on the sensation, trying to locate it, and the bond showed her. A man, perhaps 30 years old, living in the eastern provinces. He was a soldier, a captain in the kingdom's military, and he had felt the throne awaken just as everyone else had. But unlike everyone else, he had felt something more, a connection, A pull, the same compulsion that had drawn Kira to the capital. He was coming. She could feel him traveling, moving closer each day, drawn by the bond whether he understood it or not. His name was Darren, and he looked as confused as she had been when the throne first called her. "I do not understand what is happening," he said, staring at the throne. "I felt the awakening. I felt something pulling me here. And now, standing in this chamber, I feel as though I belong here in a way I have never belonged anywhere." "You carry the mark," Kira said, and she heard the relief in her own voice. "Just as I do. The throne recognizes you as one who can share the bond, who can help carry the weight of ruling. But I am a soldier. I execute strategies that others design. How can I possibly help rule a kingdom? I am a cartographer who drew maps in the wilderness. I knew nothing of governance either. But the throne does not care about our professions. Let it recognize you." She was not alone anymore. "Let it pass through and settle. It will become bearable. I promise." It took hours for Darren to stabilize, for the bond to find its new configuration with two marked souls instead of one. But when it finally settled, when he could stand and think clearly, he looked at Kira with understanding. "You have been carrying this alone," he said. "How did you survive?" "Barely. The bond was telling me I needed to find others, but I did not understand what it meant until you appeared. Now I understand. The throne was not meant for one person. It was designed for multiple rulers, each bringing different strengths, each sharing the burden, so that no one breaks under the weight." "There are others," Darren said, and Kira realized he could feel them too now, faint presences at the edge of the bond. "I can sense them. 2 more, at least." The bond was calling them, drawing them toward the capital, just as it had drawn Darren. The second marked individual, a woman named Lysa, arrived within a month. She was a scholar who had studied the throne's history, who had spent years researching the bond and the royal bloodline. Kira felt the weight ease further, felt her perspective expand to include Lysa's vast knowledge of history and governance. Lysa brought context, brought understanding of patterns that repeated across centuries, brought the wisdom to see current events as part of larger cycles. The fourth arrived 3 weeks later. When he joined them, the quartet was complete, and the bond settled into a balance that felt right, felt natural, felt like what it had always been meant to be. With all 4 of them bound to the throne, sharing the burden, they could finally begin to rule effectively. They brought different perspectives, different types of knowledge, and when they worked together, Varn called an emergency meeting, and his tone was sharp, accusatory. "You are building a new ruling class. You are surrounding yourself with marked individuals who owe loyalty to you, not to the kingdom's established order." "They do not owe loyalty to me," Kira said. "If you and these others control the throne, if you share the power that comes with it, you will become untouchable. You will be able to make decisions without oversight, without accountability, without any check on your authority. The bond is the check on our authority. It connects us to the land, to the people. We cannot rule against their interests because we feel their suffering as our own. That is more accountability than any council vote can provide. That is naive. Power corrupts, regardless of how it is obtained or how it is intended to be used. You may believe you are serving the kingdom, but give it time. Give it years, and you will find that the bond becomes less important than your own desires, your own ambitions. Then you will remove me. The council has that authority. It waited 300 years for the right person. Do you truly believe it chose wrong? Varn had no answer for that. But his resentment was clear, and Kira knew she had made an enemy. The second marked individual arrived a month later. A woman named Lysa, a scholar who had studied the throne's history. The bond was not meant to be carried by one person, because one person could not hold all the perspectives needed to govern wisely. She brought understanding of the land, of geography, of how physical space shaped human behavior. Darren brought military knowledge, strategy, and understanding of defense and conflict. Together they were more than the sum of their parts. They could make decisions that none of them could have made alone, could see problems from angles that would have been invisible to a single ruler. The bond connected them not just to the kingdom, but to each other, and they began to function as a unit. With his binding, the weight became almost comfortable, distributed among 4 souls who balanced each other perfectly. The council watched this transformation with growing alarm. They saw their power slipping away. They saw the 4 marked individuals making decisions quickly, efficiently responding to the kingdom's needs with a speed and accuracy that the council could never match. And they saw that the people were beginning to love them. The new rulers, as they were called, did not govern from a distance. They traveled the kingdom, used the bond to sense where help was needed, and went there themselves. They were visible, accessible, present in ways the council had never been. Varn saw all of this, and he made a decision. If the throne could not be controlled, it would have to be destroyed. The assassination attempt came during a public assembly. Hired killers rushed the platform, blades drawn, moving with the coordination of professionals. But the bond warned them. Kira felt the danger before the killers appeared, felt the malicious intent through the connection to the crowd, and she and the others moved before the attack came. Darren, with his military training, intercepted 2 of the killers. Tomas used his healer's knowledge of the body to disarm a 3rd with a precise strike to a pressure point. Lysa, who had studied ancient combat forms as part of her research, fought with unexpected skill. And Kira, drawing on the bond, called to the people in the crowd, asked them to help, and they responded. Citizens who had never fought in their lives rushed forward to protect their rulers. Viren was arrested along with 3 other council members. They were tried, found guilty of treason, and exiled rather than executed. But they all accepted the new reality. The throne was no longer empty, and those who sat upon it would not be removed. Struggled to coordinate their efforts when each of them felt the kingdom's needs differently. Kira felt the land most strongly. She could sense when soil was depleted, when forests were being overharvested, when the physical geography of a region was creating problems that human effort alone could not solve. He wanted to strengthen the military, to build fortifications, to prepare for threats that the others sometimes dismissed as unlikely. Lysa felt the cultural and intellectual currents. She sensed when knowledge was being lost, when education was failing. She advocated for libraries, schools, support for artists and scholars. Thomas felt the human suffering most directly. Every illness, every injury, every person in pain registered in his awareness through the bond. He wanted to pour resources into health care, into helping the most vulnerable, sometimes at the expense of other priorities. These different perspectives created tension. The four of them argued constantly in those early days, each convinced that their priority was the most important, each frustrated when the others did not share their urgency. The bond connected them, but it did not make them agree, and they had to learn the hard way that consensus required compromise, that no single perspective held all the answers. The turning point came during a crisis in the western provinces, where a combination of drought, disease, and banditry had created a humanitarian disaster. Kira wanted to address the drought first, believing that water was the foundation everything else depended on. Darren wanted to eliminate the bandits, arguing that security was necessary before any other aid could be effective. Lysa wanted to preserve the region's cultural heritage, which was in danger of being lost as people abandoned their villages. Tomas wanted to treat the sick immediately, before more died. The bond amplified their emotions, feeding their tension back to them, and they came dangerously close to fracturing, to each deciding to act independently rather than waiting for consensus. But on the third night, exhausted and discouraged, they sat together in the throne chamber, and Kira said quietly, "We are doing exactly what the council did. We are each focusing on our own domain, our own expertise, and ignoring the connections between things. The bond is showing us everything, but we are only seeing the parts we understand. What do you suggest?" Darren asked, his voice tight. "We stop trying to convince each other and start listening to each other. Not to debate, not to argue, but to truly understand why each of us feels what we feel. And then we build a solution that addresses all of it, even if it is not perfect, even if it requires more work than any single approach would." They tried. It was difficult, required them to set aside their egos, to admit that their perspective was incomplete. But slowly they began to hear each other. Darren understood why Kira prioritized water, because without it, nothing else mattered. Lysa understood why Tomas prioritized immediate medical care, because dead people could not be helped by long-term plans. Tomas understood why Darren prioritized security, because aid workers could not function in a war zone. They sent healers and medical supplies, directed by Tomas's knowledge of what was needed most urgently. And they sent scholars to document the region's stories, songs, and traditions, ensuring that even if villages were abandoned, the culture would not be lost. The response worked. Not perfectly. There were still deaths, still suffering, still failures. That crisis taught them the lesson that defined their rule. The bond was not just a tool for sensing problems. It was a tool for synthesis, for combining different types of knowledge into solutions that were greater than the sum of their parts. From that point forward, they stopped trying to be right and started trying to be complete. Lysa provided historical context, showing that ancient farming practices had included rest periods and had sustained populations for centuries. Darren suggested a military-style rotation system where different regions would rest in different years, ensuring that total production remained stable, even as individual fields recovered. Together they created a policy that addressed the environmental need without causing human suffering, that drew on history without being bound by it, that was structured enough to be implemented systematically. Within 3 years, the kingdom's agricultural output had not just recovered but surged. The land, given time to heal, gave back abundantly. The council had always prioritized the wealthy South, where most of the nobles lived, where most of the taxes came from. But through the bond, the four rulers felt the North's suffering. Lysa wanted to establish schools to give northern children the same educational opportunities as their southern counterparts. Tomas wanted clinics and healers to address the region's disproportionately high mortality rates. They did all of it, building schools that also served as community centers that strengthened social bonds and cultural identity, establishing clinics that also trained local healers, ensuring the North could eventually care for its own. The investment was massive, and the council's remaining members protested the cost. People who felt valued became loyal. Communities that thrived became stable. Regions that were connected became integrated, reducing the risk of separatism or rebellion. The mountains that had isolated the region became sites for mineral extraction, done carefully to avoid environmental damage. The harsh climate that had made farming difficult became an advantage for certain crops that thrived in cold, learning from techniques Lysa found in historical texts. The bond showed him the connections between poverty and theft, between lack of opportunity and violence, between social isolation and antisocial behavior. Kira brought geographic insight, showing that crime clustered in specific areas where economic opportunities were limited. Together, they created a comprehensive approach. They established job training programs, giving people alternatives to crime. They reformed the justice system, focusing on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. They created community support networks, ensuring that people in crisis had somewhere to turn before desperation drove them to break the law. They invested in the neighborhoods where crime was highest, not with police and prisons, but with schools and jobs and hope. It was expensive. It was complicated. It required sustained effort over years, but it worked. The prison population dropped by 70% over a decade. Violent crime became rare. Property crime declined as prosperity increased. The kingdom became safer, not because the rulers were harsher, but because they addressed the root causes rather than just the symptoms. The bond made them wise in ways that individual rulers could never be. It showed them the connections between things, the way one decision rippled through the kingdom, affecting people and places in ways that were not immediately obvious. When they considered building a dam to control flooding in one region, the bond showed them how it would affect water supply downstream, how it would impact fish populations that people depended on, how it would alter trade routes that had existed for centuries, because they could feel when their decisions caused harm, when their good intentions led to bad outcomes, when they were wrong despite their certainty. There was a terrible honesty to ruling through the bond. They could not lie to themselves about the consequences of their actions. Kira felt this most acutely during the forest management crisis. She had implemented policies to protect old-growth forests, but the policies cut off timber supplies that logging communities depended on. Environmental need that she had not adequately considered the human cost. The others helped her see the mistake without condemning her for it. Sustainably managed forests that could provide timber. It was not perfect. Some jobs were still lost. Some communities still struggled. The bond taught them all such lessons. Darren learned that military strength alone did not create security, that true safety came from prosperity and justice. Lysa learned that preserving history was not enough if people in the present were suffering too much to care about the past. And together they learned that wisdom was not about being right, but about being complete. When one of them doubted themselves, struggled, under the weight of responsibility, felt overwhelmed by the constant stream of suffering the bond revealed. The others shared the burden, reminded them they were not alone. The bond connected them not just to the kingdom, but to each other, and they functioned as a unit, a collective consciousness that governed through consensus and shared understanding, feeling through the bond how their choices would ripple through the kingdom. They did not always agree, their different perspectives still created tension, but they had learned to see that tension as valuable. The people came to love them, not just because the kingdom prospered under their rule, but because the rulers were present. They traveled constantly, used the bond to sense where they were needed, and went there themselves. When drought struck, Kira was there, working with engineers to find water. When disease broke out, Thomas was there, treating patients alongside local healers. When border tensions flared, Darren was there, negotiating and, if necessary, defending. When cultural heritage was threatened, Lysa was there, preserving and protecting. They were not distant figures ruling from a palace. They were real people, visible, accessible, vulnerable. The bond made them powerful, but it also made them human in ways that traditional rulers had never been. They felt pain when their people suffered, and the people could see it, could see that their rulers genuinely cared. This created a loyalty that the council had never enjoyed. People supported the four rulers not out of duty or fear, but out of genuine affection. They saw themselves in the rulers. Kira had been a cartographer, Darren a soldier, Lysa a scholar, Thomas a healer. They were not nobles, not aristocrats, just people who had been chosen by the throne and who took that responsibility seriously. But there were still those who opposed them. The exiled council members, led by Varan, did not give up. They settled in a neighboring kingdom, one that had always been suspicious of the bond's power, and they began spreading propaganda. They claimed that the four rulers were tyrants, that they controlled the people through magic, that the bond was not connection but enslavement. It was effective propaganda because it contained a grain of truth. The bond did connect everyone in the kingdom to the rulers. People could feel in moments of strong emotion the presence of those who sat on the throne. And while that connection was meant to ensure rulers understood their people, it could be portrayed as invasive, as a violation of privacy, as control. Some believed the propaganda. Separatist movements emerged in the outer provinces, groups that wanted to break away from the kingdom to establish independent states where the bond did not reach. They argued that the four rulers, no matter how benevolent, had too much power, that no one should be able to feel the thoughts and emotions of their citizens, that true freedom required separation. The four rulers agonized over how to respond. The bond showed them the separatists' fear, their genuine belief that they were fighting for liberty. But it also showed them the suffering that would result if the kingdom fragmented, if the integrated systems they had built, the trade networks, the mutual support, the shared resources were torn apart. They met in the throne chamber, and the debate stretched over days. Darren wanted to use military force to prevent secession before it could gain momentum. We cannot let the kingdom fall apart. The whole is stronger than the parts, and if we allow regions to break away, we will create instability that will hurt everyone. But forcing people to stay is exactly what the propaganda accuses us of, Kira argued. If we use violence to prevent secession, we prove that we are tyrants. We lose the moral authority that has been our greatest strength. What alternative do we have? Lysa asked. We cannot simply let the kingdom dissolve. Too much depends on unity. "We convince them," Thomas said quietly. "We show them that the bond is not control. We demonstrate that being part of the kingdom benefits them more than independence would. We let them see the truth rather than forcing them to accept it." It was risky. It required them to trust that truth would win over propaganda, that people would choose connection over isolation. But they tried. They traveled to the separatist regions, not with armies but with open hands. They met with the leaders of the movement, listened to their grievances, acknowledged the validity of their fears, and they offered a compromise. Regions could have more autonomy, more control over local affairs, more freedom to govern themselves in ways that reflected their unique cultures and needs. The bond would remain, but it would be used more sparingly, respected as a connection rather than exploited as a tool of control. It took months of negotiation, of building trust, of demonstrating through action that the four rulers respected the region's desire for self-determination. But slowly the separatist movements lost momentum. The four rulers let them go, painful as it was, because forcing them to stay would have violated everything they believed. The kingdom became slightly smaller, but it remained whole where it mattered most. And the separatist states, after a few years of struggling without the support systems the kingdom provided, began to reconsider. Others remained independent but established close trade and diplomatic relationships, creating a looser association that respected sovereignty while maintaining cooperation. The crisis taught the four rulers another important lesson, that even the bond had limits. That connection could not be forced, that true unity required consent. They reformed how the bond functioned, making it more respectful of individual privacy, less invasive in its constant awareness. They learned to use it judiciously, to access its full power only when absolutely necessary, to give people space to live their lives without feeling constantly observed. This made them weaker in some ways. They no longer had perfect information about what was happening in the kingdom. But it made them stronger, and others people trusted them more when they knew the bond was not being used to spy on them, when they felt that their rulers respected boundaries even when they had the power to ignore them. Kira, who had been a lonely cartographer, found family in the others. The bond connected them so deeply that they understood each other in ways that went beyond words. They knew each other's fears and hopes, strengths and weaknesses, and they loved each other not despite those imperfections, but because of them. Darren, who had been a soldier following orders, found purpose in making the decisions himself. He had spent his military career executing strategies others designed, and now he was the strategist, the one whose judgment shaped the kingdom's direction. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Lysa, who had studied history, found herself making it. She had spent years reading about kings and queens, about how they ruled and failed and succeeded, and now she was living those experiences, creating the stories that future scholars would study. It gave her a humility she had lacked as a pure academic, knowing how complex decisions were when you lived them, how much easier it was to judge from a distance than to act in the moment. Thomas, who had served the poor, found he could help them on a scale he had never imagined. Every clinic he had funded as a healer, every patient he had treated, had been individual acts of compassion. Now he could create systems that helped millions, that prevented suffering before it occurred, that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. It was the fulfillment of everything he had wanted to accomplish. They ruled for 43 years, and in that time the kingdom transformed. It became prosperous without becoming unequal, strong without becoming aggressive, united without becoming uniform. Different regions developed different characters, different cultures, different approaches to solving problems. But they remained connected, part of something larger than themselves, bound together by the bond that had awakened when Kira sat on the throne. There were still problems. There were still conflicts and failures and moments when the four rulers made mistakes that caused suffering. The bond did not make them perfect, but it made them accountable, made them aware, made them care, and that was enough. They had discussed it for years, had prepared the kingdom for the transition, had identified the next generation of marked individuals who would take their place. They returned to the throne chamber one final time, the four of them, and they sat together on the throne that had bound them for more than 4 decades. The bond pulsed through them, connecting them one last time, and they felt the kingdom they had served, the people they had governed, the land they had protected. And then, together, they released their connection. It was not painful, exactly, but it was profound. They felt themselves separating from the bond, felt the constant awareness of the kingdom fade, felt the connection to each other diminish from the overwhelming intimacy they had known to something more normal, more human. They felt themselves becoming individual again, distinct rather than collective. The new rulers were waiting, 4 marked souls who had been drawn to the capital over the past year, who had felt the throne calling them just as Kira had felt it decades ago. They approached the throne, and the bond recognized them, bound them, began the process of teaching them what they needed to know. Kira and the others watched, feeling both proud and sad, and then they descended from the dais for the last time. They were no longer rulers. They were simply people, old and tired and ready to rest. They moved to a small estate outside the capital, the 4 of them together, and because separation after so many years bound by the bond felt wrong. They lived simply, tending gardens, writing memoirs, welcoming visitors who wanted to hear stories about the early years of the awakening. Kira died 3 years later, surrounded by the others, held by the family she had found. Her last thought was not of ruling or responsibility or the weight of the bond. Her last thought was gratitude, that she had been chosen, that she had found others to share the burden, that she had been part of something larger than herself. The others followed within a year, one by one, as though the bond that had connected them in life continued to bind them even in death. And the kingdom mourned them all, not as distant rulers, but as people who had cared, who had served, who had shown that power was not about domination, but about responsibility. The throne stood, no longer empty, no longer waiting, and the bond, awakened at last, ensured that it would never be silent again. This has been a story of empty thrones and awakened bonds, of burdens shared and wisdom found in partnership. If this tale moved you, if you understood the weight of ruling alone or the relief of finding others to share it, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Do you believe power should be held by one or shared by many? What does it mean to govern through connection rather than command? If you enjoyed this journey into the world of the silent bond, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you may return when the next story is told, when another bond awakens, and when partnership, perhaps, triumphs over solitude once more.